2007 was a groundbreaking year for video games. Titles from series both new and old will become beloved classics during this iconic year for the industry. Coming off the success of System Shock 2 and Thief the Dark Project, Ken Levine and his team at Irrational Games aimed to combine the immersive sim elements of their previous titles with the console-oriented shooter mechanics that modern players had become accustomed to. The result was BioShock, a game that made an indelible mark on the gaming industry, creating a masterful blend of compelling storytelling, stunning visuals, and immersive gameplay. The title was quickly elevated to cult-like status and forever changed the face of interactive storytelling. What came afterward was a trilogy, 3 games that are as beloved as they are divisive, and a legacy that has left fans uncertain of the series' future. So stock up on Atom, charge up your drills, and book a catch, because today we're going to be entering back into the world of BioShock and see why this trilogy continues to resonate with fans over a decade later. This is the BioShock series review. In the depths of the North Atlantic Ocean, hidden away from the eyes of the world above, lies a city that defies conventional philosophy, challenges societal norms, and beckons people to explore her hauntingly beautiful depths. Welcome to Rapture, an individualist paradise turned nightmarish hellscape, and the centerpiece of one of gaming's most iconic series. The city is a brainchild of Andrew Ryan, a Russian-American oil magnate that read a little too much Ayn Rand for his own good and became dissatisfied with America's social programs, believing that those who benefited from them were parasites, siphoning money and labor from the honest, hard-working man. The catalyst for Rapture's creation was a US government nationalizing forest land that Ryan owned. The idea that the private property he worked so hard for was to become a public space for all was so disgusting to Ryan that he'd rather burn the forest down to the ground than see such a perversion of ownership come to fruition. The world's greatest scientists, philosophers, and artists were all welcomed into the city, with the promise of their work no longer being shackled down by lesser concepts such as ethics, morals, and laws. Despite its radicalism, Rapture prospered for a time, but the city's anarcho-capitalist philosophy began to clash with Ryan's ego when a smuggler named Frank Fontaine crawled his way into Rapture. There, he founded Fontaine Futuristics, a business conglomerate whose biggest product was plasmids, a substance that, when injected into the bloodstream, genetically alters the applicant with various desired effects, like growing back hair, becoming a human taser, and burning your enemies to a crisp. Things were going well for Frank Fontaine, very well. But whether out of paranoia or just plain jealousy, Ryan became suspicious of Fontaine and began spying on him. It was here where he discovered his smuggling operation. See, bringing things from the surface was a big no-no in Rapture, a cardinal sin. Fontaine had to be stopped. A short battle ensued between Ryan's robotic security forces and Fontaine's men, eventually resulting in Fontaine's supposed death. Ryan then went against his morals and nationalized Fontaine Futuristics, which left a very sour taste in the mouths of Rapture's libertarian residents. The first chip in the city's demise had fallen. Soon after Fontaine's death, a man named Atlas rose to prominence by protesting against Ryan's actions. These protests would quickly lead to the formation of a rebellion and a full-out civil war. In the midst of this chaos is a player character, Jack, an unfortunate soul that found his way into this god-forsaken city after his plane not so conveniently crash lands outside a lighthouse, which serves as Rapture's entrance. Aside from the odd in-game cutscene, audio logs are the main medium in which the story is told. Recordings of past events are spread throughout the environment, detailing anything from the horrors of the ensuing war to concerns on the city's infrastructure. The fate of the authors of such recordings, whether they turn psychotic, succumb to the drowned city's cruelty, or change their ways entirely, has already been sealed. We merely get to learn how such a fate came to be, rather than watching it occur before our very eyes. Conveying the story in such a way leans into the immersive sim nature that BioShock is trying to achieve. Such a mechanic puts you into detective mode, forcing you to look into every nook and cranny, forcing you to puzzle the story together, rather than the game doing it for you. The environments play just as important of a role in showing the decay of this Art Deco metropolis turned dilapidated ruin, how its population of intellectuals were reduced to crazed addicts in pursuit of not knowledge or creativity, but their next hit. The years may have not been kind to Rapture, but the same same cannot be said about BioShock. Almost 2 decades later, and the game's semi-realistic art style and the unique setting hold up against modern-day standards. Sound design is also excellent, albeit suffering from some pretty intense compression. The deafening groans of the Big Daddies, the small engines of the security bots, and the faint dripping of water really sells the idea of a city that's slowly being consumed, both by the chaos within and the Atlantic Ocean outside. This immersion is only intensified with the smorgasbord of licensed music, advertisements, and lived-in locations, all of which echo of a time when the city was a place where people lived, had jobs, went shopping, and fell in love. However, the same lasting quality cannot be found in BioShock's gameplay. Game director Ken Levine once said that BioShock's goal is to
redefine what it means to be a first-person shooter.
Many people look at the world's dynamism, how you can interact with so many elements of Rapture, from her pools of water to her security forces, shaping the world to your benefit or detriment. The fact that it goes beyond mere gameplay reward. Toilets, sinks, telephones can all be used despite not providing anything for doing so. But if you ask me, I'm not so convinced of BioShock's supposed dynamism. Pools of water and oil will remain in the same position. Scripted sequences will play out in the same order, with enemies spawning in more or less the same locations. Some may find this impressive, and maybe it was for 2007, especially compared to its mid-noughties competitors. But Half-Life 2, a game released 3 years prior, already allowed players to pick up and throw around pretty much anything that wasn't fixed to the floor. Duke Nukem 3D, a game from the 90s, had a plethora of interactable items, many of which served no gameplay purpose beyond making the world feel real.
Much better.
BioShock's interactability may have beat out the Halos and Call of Duties of the time, but it's hardly revolutionary. Regardless, BioShock manages to mix up the formula in its own way. Aside from the wrench, every weapon has 3 different ammo types. These can range from bullets that work better against metallic or fleshy enemies, to trap guns that let you lure enemies into snares, exploding buckshot rounds, and even an antiquated freeze ray. Combine this with the magical powers of plasmids and the gameplay-defining changes of gene tonics, and you've got the recipe for one of the many builds BioShock offers. Many opt for the wrench build, a surprisingly effective way of dealing massive damage without the need for ammunition. Personally, I went for a hacking build. I'm sure exploiting Rapture's robust supply of turrets, security bots, and cameras to do all the dirty work for me would have made Rapture's hyper-capitalistic residents proud, had they not been trying to kill me, of course. Speaking of Rapture's denizens, you have the typical melee, pistol, and rifle enemy types, mixed in with the more unique variants, such as the Houdini splices. These are the closest thing BioShock has to mages, as they can shoot fireballs, go invisible, and teleport across the arena. Spider splicers are another enemy type that can crawl on walls, as their name would suggest, and throw molten sickles at you. Aside from the plasmid addicts, Rapture's also crawling with Ryan's security bots. You have the manhacks from Half-Life 2, turrets from Half-Life 2, and cameras, also from Half-Life 2. But being the machines that they are, these robots can be hacked to fight on your side. It's a powerful skill, so long as you can bear the horribly outdated minigame you have to complete with every hack. It's a simple pipe connecting puzzle game that you would have found on the App Store in the early days of the smartphone, albeit probably more fun and less hungry for your wallet. It wouldn't be so frustrating if it didn't bring the rest of the game to a halt. 1 second you're scrambling through dark corridors, fighting for your life, and suddenly you're playing Pete the Plumber. The same problem bleeds into the photography mechanic. Early in the game, you acquire a camera which you can use to take candid stills of enemies to increase your damage against them. Like hacking, using the camera and taking photographs pauses the game to a standstill for no better reason than to watch a bar go from one side of the screen to another. Riveting. And unless you like dumping an entire arsenal on a single enemy, you better get used to using the camera for its damage increasing effects. However, all these issues are minor compared to the big daddy of them all: Adam. A substance called Adam is extracted from parasitic sea slugs found at the bottom of Rapture's ocean. It's the source of all plasmids, gene tonics, and the citizens of Rapture's insanity. But back when the city had some semblance of normalcy, there was nowhere near enough Adam to meet its exorbitant demand. That is, until a scientist, Bridget Tenenbaum, worked with Fontaine Futuristics and discovered that the yield of Adam would significantly increase if the sea slugs had a host, specifically little girls. I guess adults wouldn't have been morally questionable enough for the sea slugs. A lack of social safety nets meant that parentless children were helpless, so Frank Fontaine opened a laboratory in the guise of an orphanage. After convincing poor mothers to give up their children in exchange for cash money, the little girls would be lobotomized, have a sea slug latch onto them, and be assigned a big daddy. These were criminals and political opponents who would go through a similar lobotomization process, with the addition of having their voice boxes removed and their skin welded to a diving suit. Now, these metal husks of men wander the streets of an equally hollow fellow Rapture, repairing that which is beyond repair. Their only sign of humanity left is their stubborn protectiveness of the Little Sisters. I easily died more times to these Big Daddies than any other enemy type. Luckily, I could just respawn problem-free thanks to the Vita Chambers. These are a controversial inclusion that allow you to get revived at a checkpoint without losing any progress. Victory is not a question of if, but when. When you take down a Big Daddy, the fate of the Little Sister is in your hands. Do you save the Little Sister through the power of love or something and get Adam? Or do you rip the Sea Slug out of them and also get Adam? Sure, you only get half the Adam from saving them, but this is quickly offset by the rewards the Little Sisters give you for helping them. Despite saving all the Little Sisters in my first playthrough, I never once had to compromise on my plasmids or gene tonics. It's hardly a choice. Sure, you can technically harvest all the Sea Slugs out of the Little Sisters, but there's virtually no gameplay incentive for doing that. What if the Little Sisters provided 0 Adam for saving them? The player would then have to find vials of the stuff scattered around the environment, and even then it would only be a small amount. We even saw such a mechanic during the game's tech demo a few years prior to its release. Little Sisters could have still given gifts, but instead of something ridiculous like 200 Adam, it would be first aid kits, ammo, and maybe a unique plasmid here and there. Players would have been punished for trying to be the last moral person in a city that has discarded morality, even before they went crazy. While on the other hand, it would have seduced players into becoming as selfish and cruel as Rapture herself. Instead, we're left with a mechanic that fails to be the challenging choice that it so clearly wants to be. Or does it? It makes you wonder if all this was intentional. After all, aside from critiquing Ayn Rand's theories, BioShock is also a look into choice in video games, more specifically, a lack thereof. We see this most starkly in the game's climax, when Andrew Ryan reveals that we're no more than a dog following orders, a puppet having our strings pulled by BioShock's true villain. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is how publisher 2K proceeded with the franchise after BioShock's initial success. While Irrational worked on what will later be known as BioShock Infinite, the newly founded 2K Marin was developing a sequel of their own. Along with the help of 2K Australia, Warframe's Digital Extremes, and even Dishonored's Arcane Studios, BioShock 2 would release in February 2010. Set 8 years after the events of the first game, you're now in the boots of Subject Delta, a special Big Daddy with a unique concoction of plasmids and gene tonics pumped into him during the Big Daddification process. Daddification. That's a word now. In a centrist fashion, BioShock 2 makes us face a radical collectivist as opposed to the hyper-individualist Ryan, Dr. Lamb, a psychiatrist turned cult leader who filled the power vacuum Ryan left upon his death in the first game. While Ryan saw Rapture as more of an experiment, a test of his world vision, rather than an actual society, Lamb saw Rapture as the building grounds, the factory, for a utopia. But in order to build such a utopia, it must be preceded by a utopian, a messianic figure who can usher people into her perfect world. That's where Eleanor Lamb comes in, a little sister who is particularly resistant to the less desirable effects of Adam, allowing her to be pumped full of other people's genetic code, inheriting their memories in the process. With this backstory, BioShock 2 has the building blocks of a compelling narrative, but I couldn't for the life of me find out what the story was even trying to say. That the ends may not justify the means? That forcing people to do things is bad? It all just seems like a pointless retread. As you take a train across Rapture's for-profit railway line, you'll explore and meet those residing in working-class subsections, high-end opulence, and the workplaces of Rapture's most enlightened minds. As you fight through these sections, you'll begin to get familiar with the changes BioShock 2 made to the ebb and flow of combat. Plasmids can now be used in tandem with your guns. The hacking minigame is now a matter of reaction time rather than plumbing skills. The camera no longer pauses the game, but rather begins an arcade-style point-racking minigame. Weapons have not changed, at least not in their functionality, and only 2 new enemy types have been added, a beefy, tankier version of the melee splicers, and the Big Sisters, which act as the game's mini-bosses, even more so than Big Daddies. While these new characters are welcome additions, the game once again feels like it's doing far too little with its potential. We are 8 years on from Rapture's collapse. We can only imagine what the near decade of splicing has done to Rapture's denizens. Literally, we can only imagine this. We never get to see what kind of abominations come out of such radical genetic alteration outside of a mid-game boss fight. We only get the boring old this enemy but faster, and this enemy but stronger types. Worst of all, Adam is even worse of a mechanic this time around. As flawed as it was in the first game, it was at least straightforward. You take down a Big Daddy, walk up to its little sister, and decide whether you want to save her or harvest her. But in BioShock 2, you are the Big Daddy. How this translates to gameplay is with the addition of a Horde mode-esque mechanic. Now, when you take down the Big Daddy, you can choose to adopt the little sister and take her to 2 or 3 plasmid-filled corpses so that she can siphon the Atom from them. The entire mechanic amounts to nothing more than protecting the little sister against waves and waves of enemies as she harvests the corpse. Not only does this needlessly bog down the game's pacing and my enjoyment, it also does nothing to amend the moral questions, or lack thereof, of harvesting Atom in the game. Instead, the bonus Atom acquired from harvesting these corpses makes it that much easier to avoid resorting to harvesting Atom from a little sister. Combine this with the fact that you can find and collect Atom-filled sea slugs, and becoming the saintliest Big Daddy in town has never been easier. Superfluous is pretty much how I would describe BioShock 2 as a whole. The game lacks anything meaningful to justify its existence, and playing it feels like adding filler to a hole that was never even there. It might be fun in its moment-to-moment gameplay, but beyond that, it's just a vapid experience. Minerva's Den was released in August 2010 and has since been widely regarded as one of the best pieces of DLC in gaming. While Delta and Eleanor are trying to find each other, another experimental Big Daddy known as Subject Sigma is in the titular Minerva's Den, Rapture's Silicon Valley. Your goal is simple: get a supercomputer called a Thinker out of Rapture. At your side is Charles Milton Porter, the mind behind the machine. But with every hero, there must always be a villain, and the villain this time around is Reed Wall. Wall also worked on the Thinker. However, while Porter believed that the computer could be the first true general intelligence, Wall saw how the Thinker's predictive calculations could play a role in market manipulation. But as his Atom-infused sanity lessened, Wall's fanaticism for the computer grew. Eventually, Wall began to believe that the Thinker could accurately predict the future, being a sort of mechanical oracle. And so, for the next 2 hours, you'll be trying to acquire the Thinker off Wall's hands, all the while exploring Rapture's nerdy side. And while I kind of hated my time with BioShock 2's campaign, Minerva's Den does something that BioShock 2 fails to achieve in all avenues. It's succinct. It's an almost perfect vertical slice of the main game that drops you into this wide open environment with plenty of opportunities to explore. It has puzzles that don't hold your hand, yet at the same time don't frustrate the player. And it has a story that doesn't try to be grander or bigger or more bombastic than the original, but rather focuses on the few characters you come across within its 2-hour runtime. Combine this with the addition of new weapons, enemies, and a twist ending that genuinely took me off guard, and you've got everything you'd ever want from a BioShock sequel, all packaged into a lean 2 hours. It's no wonder why Minerva's Den is so well praised. BioShock 2 could have been just this, and I would have enjoyed it all the more. The multiplayer, on the other hand, is kind of a different story. At first glance, adding a multiplayer to a BioShock game sounds like sacrilege, a cynical adherence to the zeitgeist of adding a multiplayer component to games that had no business having them. Not too dissimilar to battle passes today or loot boxes from yesteryear, but 2K Marin was able to tie this component into the overarching story of Rapture in such an elegant way that it makes the entire concept not just acceptable, but enjoyable. Unlike the base game and Minerva's Den, the multiplayer component takes place just before the events of BioShock 1, specifically New Year's Eve 1958, the beginning of Rapture's civil war. You choose from one of a dozen characters that are customizable in both loadouts and hats. Okay. Once you're ready to step into a match, you'll be able to choose to play Team Deathmatch, Capture the Flag, or one of the many other modes you'd expect from a tacked-on multiplayer component from a 2010 game. Some Quake-like elements also make an addition. Health and eavesdrop spawn across the arena, and there's even a Big Daddy suit that lets whoever is lucky enough to take it first wreak havoc on the lobby. Once you're done with the match, you can go back to your apartment. Yes, you have an apartment, where you can listen to audio diaries, customize your loadout, or just enjoy the view with some music. Nice. It's an interesting game mode that I'm sure I would have enjoyed in 2010, however, even talking about it now feels redundant. Such is the fate of all multiplayer games. BioShock 2's online scene is completely dead, and has been so for the past decade. 2K didn't even bother adding it back into the remaster, so outside of lobbies you can make with your friends, you're gonna have a hard time experiencing this mode at all. But that's probably fine for most. Overall, I did not enjoy my time with Bioshock 2, and I have no idea where the sudden praise for this game is coming from. Sure, it adds a few quality of life improvements, but is that really all it takes to justify a sequel now? I don't think so. And apparently neither does Ken Levine in Irrational Games, since for better or worse, the next and final game would drastically change the course of the series.
Booker, are you afraid of God?
No. But I'm afraid of you.
Bioshock Infinite is the third and, thus far, final mainline installment of the Bioshock franchise. With it, it brings a new city, a new time period, and a whole host of gameplay and story changes. But still, it's Ken Levine, it's Irrational Games. What could possibly go wrong? Upon its release, Bioshock Infinite was met with near unanimous praise and received both critical and commercial success. This was to the glee of most. Finally, a game to rival the movies, the critics thought. This will prove that video games are more than mindless murder and mayhem meant to satiate the male power fantasy. But as the dust settled and the hype died down, many fans felt that Infinite was not only a deviation from the core elements of what made a Bioshock game, well, a Bioshock game, but as a complete failure of a video game as a whole. It's hard to understand this when you play it for the first time, as you break through the clouds and witness Columbia's picturesque sky and titanic monuments for the first time. It's a far cry from the rusted old ruins of Rapture, that's for sure. But the more you explore her streets, the more you come to realize that Columbia is far uglier within. The city is rife with racism, sexism, and hatred of anyone who wouldn't fit into a 1940s pro-German propaganda poster. You're going to see racist representations of African Americans, Native Americans, and Asians. You'll find statues dedicated to John Wilkes Booth and paintings representing Abraham Lincoln as the devil. You'll partake in parades that include throwing baseballs at mixed-race couples and encounter the cruelty of a unionless workplace. You may enter Columbia in awe, but upon leaving, the only beauty you'll see in the city is when it's burning to the ground. I went through a similar experience with Infinite itself. It's easy to get lost in graphics and sound design. The ear-bleeding screeches of Songbird, the deafening gunshots in firefights, the chaotic score, and the layers upon layers of ambient sound all make Columbia feel alive in a way that Rapture never was. But it doesn't take long for Infinite's superficial elements to wear off, and the game's glaring issues come front and center. Fans are immediately going to notice how different Infinite feels to the previous games. You can only carry 2 weapons, hacking and photography have been removed entirely, and the open-ended environments have been replaced with a more linear style of level design. Some would argue that these changes were made to make the game more focused and tailored towards a specific goal, not to mention the fact that the game was still running on 7th generation consoles at the tail end of their lifespan. While all this may be true, I can't help but shake the feeling that the decision to cut down the design had far more cynical motives. Bioshock Infinite, after all, was a very expensive game. Expensive games need to appeal to large audiences to churn a profit. The best way Irrational saw of translating this philosophy to gameplay was by cutting out all the things that could slow down the pacing and increase the complexity, in favor of a game loop that's modern, streamlined, and populist. One that relies on its viscerality rather than depth. For the most part, Irrational was successful in this endeavor. The transition from regular gameplay to combat has never felt smoother. Every aspect of the gunplay, from the weapons to the salts, to the newly introduced Skyhook, all emphasize a sense of power and excitement that was seldom felt in the first game. If there was a part of the original game that was less engaging than first-person combat, Infinite's design philosophy was to cut that element out completely, rather than refine it into something interesting. It's understandable why they did this, but it's strange nonetheless, considering the fact that Bioshock 2 already faced and solved this dilemma. The hacking and camera minigames were completely overhauled to complement the core gameplay, rather than sidetrack it. But Infinite decided that wasn't enough, so they removed these mechanics entirely, in lieu of a mere press of a button via a Vigor or Companion respectively. The Companion in question is Elizabeth, a young woman that comes off as a helpless fish out of water at first, but quickly evolves into one of gaming's most iconic characters of all time. Your first impression of her is that of a monster, locked away in the cage for being too ugly, too dangerous for the outside world. But after breaking her out and spending some time with her, both the player and Elizabeth realize that the world is a far cooler place than she could ever be. That's not to say that Elizabeth is some damsel in distress, however. She won't blindly follow Booker and accept him for who he is. She'll question his morals, accuse him of being violent and lying, and even abandon him halfway through the story. This may seem radical for video games, a female character that isn't there to purely serve the more than likely male player base, but this couldn't be further from the truth. When the time comes to start shooting folks in the head, Elizabeth fades into the background. She throws health, mana, and ammo your way, and even opens tears, windows to other realities, at your command. This is an interestingly bad choice. Interesting because while the rest of the game seems to be designed to serve the narrative and the narrative alone, it makes no narrative sense for the enemies to completely ignore the most important person in the entire city. Bad because such an inconsequential element to the gameplay just further drains an already shallow loop. I get it. Escort missions aren't exactly the most well-liked feature in video games, and Bioshock Infinite was trying to be as appealing as possible, depth be damned. And while what we have is a far better alternative to a poorly implemented escort system, that doesn't mean that what we got isn't a cheap cop-out. I don't think it's saying much, nor do I think it would be too frustrating to have to protect Elizabeth in some capacity. It could have even opened the doors to further tying the narrative with the gameplay. Perhaps we could have seen Elizabeth's self-reliance evolve over the course of the story, as she goes from being somewhat helpless to actively contributing to the fight, which will make it all the more impactful when she becomes the player character in Burial at Sea, the most powerful of all beings in video game land. Instead, Elizabeth is nothing but, as Tevis Thompson puts it, a companion cube in a corset that serves little gameplay purpose beyond driving the story forward. The story in question is by far Infinite's most egregious aspect. It starts off simple enough. DeWitt unfortunately stopped gambling before he won the jackpot, and he's now left with a huge debt for some bad people. His only means of paying it off is to accept a job, go to the city of Columbia, and retrieve her heir, a girl named Elizabeth. And so, with these building blocks, Bioshock Infinite goes from being about a simple tale of escaping a tyrannical ruler into a story between Booker and Elizabeth. One that goes into the weeds about forgiveness, redemption, and the cycle of violence. The latter theme is explored with the most care, with that of systemic racism and white supremacy being quickly thrown to the wayside. This is best seen halfway through the story when you encounter the Vox Populi, a workers' rebellion that sparked in retaliation for the inhumane treatment and exploitation of anyone that wasn't a God-fearing white man. And while the rebellion's intentions were good, the game makes a point, in a painfully centrist fashion, to emphasize that the rebellion is often unnecessarily violent and cruel themselves, leading it and its leader, Daisy Fitzroy, going down a path that's just as intolerant, only to another group, another class of people. Is this class of people not merely a byproduct of the system they're under, asks Infinite? Would their behavior not change if they were in a different time, a different place, a different reality, perhaps? Is it ever justified to hate someone else, even those as repulsive as Columbia's first-class citizens? The layman and the coward would say that this is smart writing that doesn't placate to a specific agenda, because apparently, good writing is when it has nothing to say. But to anyone else, this is an outright disrespectful moral equivalence between Columbia's oppressors and her oppressed. Infinite says that any radical idea, no matter if it's radical racism or radical racial equality, is just as dangerous as one another.
When it comes down to it, the only difference between Comstock and Fitzroy is how you spell the name.
Fitzroy's no better than Comstock.
Yes, we can bask in the gleeful slaughter of people as their faces are pecked away by magical ravens, but let's not get too worked up by human rights, Infinite says. It all ends up being set dressing for the real story, that of alternate dimensions, quantum physics, and the relationship between Booker and Elizabeth, the conclusion of which you won't even get to see unless you cough up a few extra dollars and see it in Burial at Sea, Infinite's two-part expansion. From Elizabeth's perspective, Burial at Sea Episode 1 takes place immediately after the conclusion of Infinite, except we're now in a different place and time, specifically Rapture 1959. We're once again in the shoes of a now considerably older DeWitt, one from another reality. Instead of fighting his way through Columbia, this Booker spends his days drowning in alcoholism as a private detective. Then in comes Elizabeth. Unlike Booker, this is the same Elizabeth from Infinite, despite her new look. And like Infinite, Burial at Sea's story begins rather simply. Elizabeth encourages us to reopen a case Booker had for a missing girl, an orphan named Sally, and we're immediately pulled out of our booze-filled slumber and thrusted out into the underwater city. As soon as you exit the doors of your office, you witness something that fans have been waiting 7 years to see, a city in her prime. free from the spliced up monstrosities and its wealth inequality hidden behind closed doors. This is how you do a love letter. But love letters are short, and this slice of Rapture is only explorable for all of 20 minutes before we're sent down to a dilapidated department store turned open prison, in a part of the expansion that looks and feels much more akin to the Rapture from the first two games. It's here where we get our first taste of Burial at Sea's gameplay. Classic splicers make a return, albeit in the form of reskins of Infinite's enemies. Big Daddies and other more advanced enemies are completely absent from the combat loop, but all that can be somewhat excused, as weapons can, once again, be used all at once via a weapon wheel, and environments are much more opened up. These changes are all appreciated, but like the rest of Infinite's design, it feels like a cynical attempt to make amends for the base game's shallow gameplay. You can almost feel a constant imaginary "I'm sorry" sign displayed in bright neon lights whenever the game reveals a new old mechanic that makes a return. That doesn't mean Burial at Sea has shaken the Infinite bug off completely. The game will occasionally open back up into the not so well loved Quake-style arenas that Infinite is known for. They even awkwardly tacked on the Skyhook mechanic. I guess the developers couldn't get enough of using this thing. The first chapter ends rather abruptly, but that's fine considering episode 2 begins right from where it left off. After an incident regarding a Big Daddy, you're now put in the shoes, or high heels in this case, of Elizabeth. To Elizabeth, Sally was not a little girl to save, but rather a mere pawn in her plan to seek revenge on Comstock. Every Comstock, from every universe. And all is well. Elizabeth now lives a picturesque life in Paris, where the sunset casts over the Eiffel Tower, the locals paint her portraits, and the birds land on her fingertips and sing. But a life of guilt is not a life worth living, and Elizabeth comes to find this after a nightmarish epiphany, where she realizes that sacrificing Sally for her own selfish agenda made her no better than Comstock. And so, she leaves behind everything she ever wanted and returns to Rapture to save Sally, losing her tear powers in the process and becoming a normal person, bound by the rules of a single universe. Despite its underwater setting, the game thematically and tonally feels far more reminiscent of Infinite, mixed in with some very basic stealth mechanics. Going in guns blazing is still an option, but the episode was clearly intended to be played in the familiar rhythm of sneaking through oversized vents, luring enemies with gadgets, and knocking them out from behind. It's as generic of a stealth system as they come. This gameplay may be antithetical to Infinite's design philosophy, which favored being as accessible and bombastic as possible over anything else, but I actually like the concept of a stealth-themed Bioshock. And after all, you're not playing as Booker or Jack or Subject Delta. You're not some army veteran that has years of training and warfare to validate their ability and resolve to slaughter hundreds of people. You're someone who not too long ago was but a person locked away in a tower full of books and scientists and dreams. Elizabeth comes equipped with a crossbow that can be switched with 3 different types of darts. Sleep darts, which knock out enemies, gas darts that do the same thing and condense crowds, and alarm darts that distract enemies with a sound. If this sounds overpowered, that's because it is, but it only gets worse. A new plasmid called Peeping Tom is also introduced. This liquid cheat code lets you see through walls and go invisible, hence the pervy name. Early in the episode, you can find an upgrade for this plasmid that lets you go invisible without any EVE cost, making the plasmid go from grossly overpowered to trivializing every combat encounter so much that they lose all meaning. Even in 1998 mode, the supposed hardest difficulty, where you can only use non-lethal weapons and plasmids, the game was laughably simple. Knock an enemy out, go invisible, wait until they forget about me, and repeat. I only died twice during my entire playthrough, and one of them was out of curiosity. Calling the gameplay half-baked is an understatement. This shit is raw. But I don't think anyone is playing Burial at Sea for its innovative gameplay. People want to see how the curtains of this series comes to a close. Questions like the origins of Songbird, how Jeremiah Fink invented salts, and Daisy Fitzroy's true motives are all answered in this expansion. Granted, some reveals are done better than others, but you'll learn tidbits of lore that connect the first and last game, and unearth questions that left players confused in Infinite's campaign. You'll get to see familiar faces one last time, witness scenes that were previously only inferred through audio logs, and learn that 2 hyper-capitalistic individuals can turn what would usually be an incredible achievement of science into a petty back and forth between who has the more marketable and profitable product. The ending is exciting, endearing, and retroactively makes Elizabeth the central character character of the series, whose ghost can be felt on any playthrough of Bioshock 1 and 2 thereafter. And that's where the Bioshock series comes to an end. A new Bioshock game was supposedly in the works and was announced in 2019, but it's been radio silent since. And with Ken Levine moving on to other projects in his own studio, I think it's safe to say that Bioshock's curtains have come to a close. But who knows? There is, after all, always another story to tell. Always another lighthouse. Thank you for watching.